wind was a blade against Clara Rollins' face, sharp and cold enough to steal the breath from her lungs. It whipped her black morning dress against her legs as she pushed the last shovelful of frozen earth onto the mound. The ground was stubborn, fighting the shovel with every push, just as it had fought to take her husband. Now it had him. James was gone, buried beneath a thin blanket of dirt that would soon be covered in snow. She stood alone at the crude grave, a solitary figure against the vast, unforgiving Wyoming sky. The few townspeople from Sage Hollow who had bothered to watch the burial had already retreated to the warmth of their homes. Their duty done. They had stood at a distance, their faces pinched with a mixture of pity and judgment. Clara could feel their unspoken words hanging in the frigid air. James Rollins had been a fool. He had pushed too hard, spoken too loud, and fought for a piece of land that a bigger man wanted. He had brought this trouble on himself, and by extension, on his wife. Clara felt nothing but a hollow ache where her heart used to be. The grief was a physical weight, pressing down on her shoulders, making it hard to stand. She and James had come west with dreams of a life built with their own hands, a life of freedom and promise. They had poured every cent and every drop of sweat into their small homestead, a patch of dirt that was now marked by a shallow grave. He had died defending it in a spray of gunfire that still echoed in her nightmares. Now she was a widow at 24, with no money, no family, and no one to turn to. Returning to the small, two-room cabin felt like walking into another grave. The silence was deafening. Every object held a memory of James, his worn hat hanging on a peg by the door, his half-finished cup of coffee still on the table, the scent of his tobacco lingering faintly in the air. The cold had seeped through the chinks in the logs, and the fire in the hearth had long since died. She was too tired, too empty, to even think of rekindling it. She sank onto their bed, the corn husk mattress rustling beneath her, and pulled a threadbare quilt over her body, not for warmth, but to hide from the emptiness that surrounded her. The next day brought the banker, a portly man named Mr. Henderson, whose sympathy was as thin as the winter sun. He cleared his throat, avoiding her gaze as he explained the legalities. The loan for the land was in James's name. With him gone, and no means to make the upcoming payment, the bank had no choice but to reclaim the property. He gave her 1 week. 1 week to dismantle a life, 1 week to pack up the remnants of a shattered dream. Desperation became Clara's constant companion. She tried to sell their meager possessions, hoping to gather enough coin for a stagecoach ticket, though she had no idea where she would even go. She laid out James's tools, the sturdy German steel axe he had been so proud of, the plow they had nearly starved to purchase. She offered the spare furniture, the rocking chair James had made for her, the small pine table where they had shared their meals. The neighbors came, but not to buy. They came to stare. Goodwife Albright pursed her lips and shook her head, muttering to her husband about the bad luck that clung to the Rollins homestead. Another farmer picked up the axe, weighed it in his hand, then set it down again. His eyes filled with a wary superstition. "A tool used by a dead man brings a curse," he said, more to himself than to her. The whispers followed her like a shadow. Cursed. That was the word they used. She was the widow of a troublemaker, a woman touched by violence and death. No one wanted any part of it. With the homestead picked bare by creditors and her own failed attempts to sell what was left, she walked the 3 miles into Sage Hollow. The town was little more than a single dusty street lined with wooden storefronts, a saloon, a church, and a general store. It was a place that prided itself on hard work and respectable folk, and Clara, a lone woman with no family to speak for her, was now neither. She tried the hotel first, asking if they needed a laundress or a cook. The owner, a man with a greasy apron and a wandering eye, looked her over and said he had all the help he needed. At the Mercantile, Mr. Gable shook his head regretfully. "Times are hard. Mrs. Rollins, I can't afford to hire anyone." He didn't add the unspoken part, that hiring a woman like her would be bad for business. Respectable wives wouldn't want to shop in a store where a cursed widow worked. Day after day, she faced the same rejection. The doors of the small community were closed to her, locked tight by suspicion and fear. She was an outsider, a problem no one wanted to solve. Her savings dwindled to a few pennies, just enough for a small bag of flour and some beans. Hunger became a dull, constant ache in her belly. It was on her last day, as the sun began to set, casting long, cold shadows across the street, that Silas Croft approached her. He was the wealthiest man in the county, a rancher with a sprawling empire and a reputation for getting whatever he wanted. He was an older man, his face a roadmap of wrinkles and his belly straining against the buttons of his fine wool coat. He tipped his hat, a gesture that felt more like a claim than a courtesy. "Mrs. Rollins," he said, his voice smooth and low. "I heard about your troubles. A tragedy. A real tragedy." Clara clutched her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Croft." "A woman like you shouldn't be left to fend for herself," he continued, his eyes lingering on her face, her slender frame. "It's not right. This is a hard country for a woman alone." She knew what was coming. She had seen the way men like him looked at women like her, women with no one to protect them. They saw weakness, an opportunity. "I can offer you a solution," he said, stepping closer. The smell of whiskey and cigars clung to him. "I have a large house, plenty of work for a woman's hands. You would have a roof over your head, food in your belly, protection." The word hung in the air between them, heavy and ugly. Protection. He wasn't offering a job. He was offering a gilded cage. She would be his property, expected to warm his bed and submit to his whims in exchange for survival. The thought made her stomach churn with a sickness far worse than hunger. She looked him straight in the eye, her own gaze clear and cold as ice. "I am not for sale, Mr. Croft." His smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of irritation. "You mistake my generosity for something else. Girl, it's a kind offer, the only one you're like to get. Think on it. When you're starving in a ditch, my offer might look a lot better." He turned and walked away, leaving her shivering in the growing twilight, the weight of his threat settling upon her. That night, she made her decision. If the world of men and towns had cast her out, she would seek her chances elsewhere. The mountains loomed to the west, a jagged line of purple and gray against the horizon. They were wild, dangerous, home to wolves and winter storms, but they were also a place of solitude, a place where the whispers of Sage Hollow could not reach her. She packed what little she had left, a thick wool blanket, the small bag of dried beans, a tin cup, and a water skin. Lastly, she took James's revolver from the wooden box beneath their bed. The Colt Peacemaker was heavy in her hand, cold and deadly. James had taught her how to shoot, to load the cylinder and sight down the barrel. "Just in case," he had said. She had never fired it at anything but an empty can. Now, it felt like the only friend she had left in the world. She saddled her horse, Daisy, a gentle mare with a coat the color of honey. The horse was all she had of value, and she knew she should have sold her, but she couldn't bear the thought. Daisy was a link to the life she had lost, a living, breathing creature in a world that had become cold and silent. Clara did not look back at the cabin or the grave as she rode away. She fixed her eyes on the rising slopes of the mountains, her jaw set with a grim determination. She would survive. She had to. It was the only way to honor the man who had died for this land. The first day of travel was bearable. The air was crisp, and the sun offered a weak, watery warmth. But as she climbed higher, the landscape grew more rugged, the trees thicker, the trail harder to follow. The wind began to bite, carrying the scent of snow. By the second afternoon, the sky had turned a leaden gray. The first flakes began to fall, soft and delicate at first, then harder, thicker. driven by a rising wind. A sense of dread began to creep into Clara's heart. She was a prairie girl. She knew the danger of a sudden blizzard. She urged Daisy onward, searching desperately for some kind of shelter, a cave, an overhanging rock, anything to shield them from the storm's fury. The world dissolved into a swirling vortex of white. The snow came down in a blinding sheet, erasing the trail, the trees, the very shape of the land. The wind howled like a hungry animal, tearing at her clothes and stinging her exposed skin. Daisy whinnied in fear, stumbling on the uneven, snow-covered ground. Clara could no longer feel her fingers or her toes. The cold was a deep, seeping thing, leaching the strength from her bones. She dismounted, hoping to lead the horse, but every step was a struggle against the wind and the deepening drifts. Her body screamed with exhaustion. She fell once, then twice, the snow a deceptively soft blanket that invited her to simply lie down and rest. The thought was tempting, a siren's call to sleep, to let the cold take her and end the pain. But the image of James's face, smiling and full of hope, flashed in her mind. She could not give up. She pushed herself to her feet one last time, taking a few more stumbling steps before her legs finally gave out. She collapsed into a snowdrift, the world spinning around her. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was the vague, dark shape of something man-made through the blizzard. A structure, a cabin perhaps, or maybe it was just a trick of the dying light. A final, cruel mirage. Then there was only the cold and the silence. Warmth was the first thing she registered, a deep, penetrating warmth that seemed to be pulling her back from a great, cold distance. Then came the scent of wood smoke and roasting meat, a smell so rich and savory it made her empty stomach clench. She felt the heavy weight of a fur blanket over her, rough and smelling of pine and animal. Clara's eyelids fluttered open. The light was dim, flickering. She was lying on a pallet of straw and furs near a large stone fireplace where a low fire crackled and hissed. The room was small, the walls built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. The walls were adorned not with pictures or decorations, but with tools of survival. Hunting rifles mounted on wooden pegs, snowshoes, and a collection of steel traps hanging from a nail. Her gaze traveled from the rifles to the figure sitting in one of the chairs by the fire. A man. He was staring into the flames, his back partially to her. He was broad-shouldered, dressed in buckskin and worn denim. His hair was dark and shaggy, touching the collar of his shirt. He seemed perfectly still, a part of the quiet, rustic cabin itself. A small cough escaped her lips, dry and raw. The man turned his head slowly. His face was all angles and shadows in the firelight. It was a hard face, weathered by sun and wind, with lines etched around his eyes and mouth that spoke of a difficult life. A dark, untrimmed beard covered his jaw, but it was his eyes that held her. They were a pale, startling blue, and they watched her with an unnerving intensity, guarded and unreadable. There was no welcome in them, no curiosity, only a flat, neutral assessment. He rose from his chair. He was tall, taller than James had been, and he moved with a quiet, deliberate grace that seemed at odds with his rugged appearance. He walked to the hearth, ladled some broth from a pot hanging over the fire into a wooden bowl, and brought it to her. He knelt beside her pallet, not too close, and held it out. "Drink," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel. Clara pushed herself up on her elbows, her body aching and weak. She took the bowl with trembling hands, the warmth seeping into her frozen fingers. She drank the broth greedily. It was hot and salty, with the rich taste of venison. It was the most wonderful thing she had ever tasted. When she finished, he took the empty bowl from her without a word and returned to his chair by the fire. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the crackling of the logs. Clara's mind, slow and foggy, began to clear. She was in a stranger's cabin, a man who lived alone in the mountains, surrounded by guns. Every instinct screamed danger. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice raspy. "My cabin," he answered, not looking at her. Who are you?" He hesitated for a moment, as if the question were an intrusion. "Eli Carver." The name meant nothing to her. "You found me." "Found your horse first. You were half buried in the snow. Lucky I was checking my trap lines." He spoke in short, clipped sentences, offering no more information than was necessary. She pulled the fur blanket tighter around herself, her fear warring with a profound sense of gratitude. He had saved her life. But why? Men in this part of the country rarely did anything for nothing. She looked at his hands, resting on the arms of his chair. They were large and calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked and fought. And deep within his guarded eyes, she saw something else, something buried and painful that he kept locked away. "The storm's not letting up," he said, his gaze still fixed on the fire. "Could last for days. You can stay until you're well enough to ride." It was not an invitation, but a simple statement of fact. He had rescued her from the storm, and he would give her shelter until it passed. After that, she would be on her own again. Clara lay back down, her head spinning. She was alive. She was warm, but she was not safe. She was trapped by the blizzard in a remote cabin with a hard, silent stranger, a man whose past was a complete mystery. She didn't trust him, not for a second, but as the wind howled outside, shaking the very walls of the cabin, she knew with a chilling certainty that she had nowhere else to go. The days that followed bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light through the cabin's single grime-streaked window. Outside, the world remained a maelstrom of white. The snow fell relentlessly, piling in great drifts against the door and walls, sealing them inside the small, smoky room. The isolation was absolute. For Clara, it was a slow return to life. The deep, bone-aching cold of the blizzard receded, replaced by the dull ache of muscles unused and the sharp pangs of a hunger that was finally being sated. Eli Carver remained a ghost in his own home. He was a creature of routine and silence. Each morning, before the sun had fully risen, he would be up, stoking the fire until it roared back to life. His movements economical and quiet. He would leave a plate of fried salt pork and a tin cup of bitter coffee on the hearth for her before pulling on his heavy winter coat and snowshoes and disappearing into the white wilderness. He would be gone for hours, sometimes the entire day, returning with a brace of rabbits or a grouse slung over his shoulder. He never spoke of where he went or what he saw. He was simply a presence that came and went, as predictable and as distant as the rising and setting of the unseen sun. He avoided her eyes. When she spoke, offering a quiet thank you for the food, he would give a short, sharp nod, his gaze fixed on the fire, the floor, the rifles on the wall, anywhere but her face. The emotional distance he kept was as vast and as cold as the snow-covered mountains outside. Yet, his actions contradicted his demeanor. He made sure she was warm, fed, and had water. He had cleaned and oiled her husband's revolver, which he'd found in her saddlebag, and placed it on the small crate beside her pallet. It was a gesture she couldn't decipher. Was it a kindness, ensuring she had her protection, or a warning, a reminder of the violent world they both inhabited? As her strength returned, Clara could no longer bear the helplessness of lying on the pallet. She began to move about the small cabin, her steps tentative at first. She swept the rough plank floor with a broom made of bound twigs. She washed their few dishes in a bucket of melted snow. She took the rabbits he brought back and stewed them with the last of her dried beans, the savory aroma filling the cramped space and, for a moment, making it feel less like a prison and more like a shelter. Eli accepted her contributions with the same stoic silence, but she noticed he ate the stew she prepared, every last bite. One evening, while Eli was outside splitting the last of the wood he'd hauled in before the storm, a gnawing curiosity finally overwhelmed her caution. His belongings were sparse, a testament to a life stripped down to its essentials, but on a small, crudely made shelf above his own bedroll in the far corner, there was a worn, leather-bound book. It was not a Bible. Its cover was scuffed and scarred, the leather dark with age and use. It felt like the only personal object in the entire cabin. Her hands trembled slightly as she took it down. It was a journal. The pages were filled with a jagged, forceful script. The ink faded in some places, dark and angry in others. It was not a diary of daily events, but a chaotic collection of thoughts. Some pages were filled with half-scribbled phrases. The price of a man's soul. West of the Pecos. God stops listening. Redemption is just a word for forgetting. Interspersed with the words were drawings, sketched with a startling skill. She saw the grim, gaunt faces of men, maps of canyons and riverbeds, and, more disturbingly, sketches that looked like battlefields. She saw the layout of a dusty street, with X's marking positions in doorways and on rooftops. It was the cold geometry of a gunfight. Then she found the list. It was a list of names, perhaps a dozen of them. Henry Sloan, Marcus Thorne, the Miller brothers. Each name was written in that same aggressive hand, and beside each one was a date. And through every single name, a thick, dark line had been drawn, crossing them out with a finality that sent a shiver down her spine. These were not debts paid. This was a ledger of death. Her suspicion hardened into a near certainty. Eli Carver was no simple trapper or mountain man. He was, or had been, a gunslinger, a man who lived by the revolver and whose past was littered with crossed-out names. She closed the journal, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, and quickly put it back on the shelf just as she heard the crunch of his boots in the snow outside the door. She scurried back to the hearth, her mind reeling. The man who had saved her life was a killer. The knowledge was terrifying, yet it explained so much: the guarded eyes, the haunted silence, the rifles on the wall. He was a man hiding from a life she could barely imagine. A new kind of tension began to grow in the cabin, thicker and more potent than the silence that had preceded it. It was an awareness of each other that was both awkward and intensely charged. Clara found herself watching him, studying the way he cleaned his rifle with methodical precision, the fluid strength in his shoulders as he chopped wood, the deep lines on his face when he thought she was not looking, and sometimes, when she was stirring the stew or mending a tear in her dress by the firelight, she would feel the weight of his gaze on her. When she looked up, he would immediately turn away, his expression unreadable, but she had seen it. He was watching her, too. One afternoon, the steady, rhythmic thud of his axe splitting firewood outside suddenly stopped. It was followed by a sharp, guttural curse. Clara rushed to the door and peered out. Eli was standing with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. He was staring at his left hand. A dark line of red was welling up, dripping onto the pristine white snow. The axe, slick with blood, lay at his feet. He must have missed his mark, the blade glancing off the log and into his own hand. Without thinking, she grabbed a strip of clean linen she had been saving and hurried out into the biting cold. "Let me see," she said, her voice firm. He turned, a dark scowl on his face. "It's nothing." "It is not nothing. You are bleeding all over the snow," she insisted, reaching for his hand. He flinched, pulling back as if her touch might burn him. But she was persistent, gently but firmly taking his large, calloused hand in her own. The cut was deep, a nasty gash across his palm. The sight of his blood made her feel a strange, protective surge. "Come inside," she ordered, her tone leaving no room for argument. He followed her, a reluctant giant, and sat heavily in the chair by the fire while she fetched the bucket of clean water. She knelt before him and began to clean the wound. His hand was rough and scarred, a map of a hard-lived life. Yet, as she worked, she could feel the tension in him, the tight control he held over himself. Her fingers, small and gentle against his, worked methodically, washing away the blood. Their closeness was a palpable thing. She could feel the heat radiating from his body, smell the scent of pine and cold air that clung to him. She was keenly aware of his breathing, of the way his chest rose and fell. She wrapped the linen tightly around his palm, her head bowed to her task. When she finished, she tied the knot and her fingers lingered for a second too long on his wrist. She looked up, and for the first time, he did not look away. His pale blue eyes met hers, and in their depths, she saw a flicker of something she had not seen before. Not anger, not indifference, but a raw, aching vulnerability. It was as if the wound in his hand had opened a crack in the armor around his soul. The moment stretched, fragile and unspoken, filled with a meaning neither of them was ready to confront. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slammed back into place. He pulled his hand away, stood up, and walked to the far side of the cabin, turning his back to her. The invisible wall between them was once again firmly in place, but now they were both aware of the door that had been briefly opened. The argument, when it finally came, erupted out of the strained silence. It was a few days later, the air in the cabin thick with unspoken thoughts. Clara could no longer stand the pretense, the feeling of living with a ghost who carried a ledger of dead men in his journal. "Why are you hiding up here?" she asked abruptly, her voice sharp. Eli was sharpening a skinning knife by the fire, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone the only sound. He did not stop. "Not hiding, living." "There is a difference," she shot back, her frustration boiling over. "You barely speak. You disappear for hours. You live like a man with no name." She took a breath. "I saw your journal, Eli." The scraping stopped. He set the knife and stone down on the hearth with slow, deliberate care. He still did not look at her. "You had no right. And you had no right to leave me wondering if the man who saved my life might also be the man who ends it." The words were out before she could stop them, harsher than she intended. He finally turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a cold fire. "If I wanted you dead, woman, you would have been dead in the snow. Do you think I would have hauled you back here, fed you, kept you warm, if I meant you any harm? Then what do you mean? Who are those men on your list? What did you do?" His face hardened into a mask of stone. "That is my business. It has nothing to do with you." He stood up, towering over her. "You know nothing about the world. You come from your safe little life, with your husband and your home, and you think you understand things. You do not." The mention of her husband, of the life that had been torn from her, was like a slap. "My safe little life? My husband was shot down in the dirt over a piece of land. I buried him myself. I was cast out by my town and left to starve. Do not you dare speak to me of what I know." Tears of anger and grief welled in her eyes. "Whatever you are running from, it cannot be worse than what I have already lost." His anger seemed to drain away, replaced by something else, something that looked almost like fear. The fire in his eyes softened, and he looked away, his jaw tight. "Yes," he said, his voice a low, rough whisper. "It can—" He turned his back on her again, ending the conversation. He had not been cruel. His anger had been a shield, a desperate attempt to push her away, to keep his past buried. She understood then that his solitude was not a preference, it was a penance. A fragile truce settled between them in the days after the argument. The air was clearer, the questions unasked but understood. Clara began to help him in more meaningful ways. The storm had damaged the cabin, shaking loose some of the chinking between the logs. Together, they mixed mud and dried grass, and she handed him clumps of the mixture as he stood on a crate, forcing it into the gaps. They worked in a comfortable, silent rhythm, their hands and bodies moving in a strange, unspoken partnership. The shared, simple task of repairing his shelter began to repair the breach between them. In the quiet companionship of their work, Clara found a small, warming comfort. The isolation of the mountains no longer felt like a prison. It was becoming a sanctuary, a world that contained only the two of them. One evening, as darkness fell, a new sound pierced the steady moan of the wind. It was a long, mournful howl, rising and falling in the distance, closer than she had ever heard it before. A wolf. The sound was primal, lonely, and filled with a wild hunger that spoke of the unforgiving nature of the world outside their door. Another howl answered the first, this one seeming to come from just beyond the tree line. A tremor of pure, animal fear shot through Clara. She was a woman of the plains, where the dangers were vast but visible. The mountains held different fears, older and more hidden. She looked at Eli. He was sitting by the fire, cleaning his pistol, seemingly unperturbed. But she saw the way his hands had stilled, the way his head was cocked, listening. The wolf howled again, a chilling cry that sounded as if it were right outside the cabin wall. Despite the warmth from the fire, a cold dread washed over Clara. She thought of the flimsy wooden door, the darkness pressing in on them, the wildness of the world she had fled into. All the loss, the fear, the desperation of the past weeks coalesced into a single, overwhelming feeling of being utterly alone and vulnerable. She looked at her own cold, empty pallet on one side of the hearth. Then she looked at Eli, a formidable silhouette against the flickering flames. He was a man of violence and secrets, a man she should fear. But in that moment, he was also strength. He was a wall against the terrifying darkness. The silence in the cabin was his. The warmth from the fire was his. The very air she breathed was his. He was survival. Slowly, trembling, she stood up from her pallet. She crossed the small space between them and, without a word, she slipped into his bedroll beside him, pulling the thick fur up to her chin. Eli froze. Every muscle in his body went rigid. He did not look at her, did not move. He just sat there, his pistol still in his hand, staring into the fire as if he had been turned to stone. The tension in the air was so thick she could barely breathe. She expected him to push her away, to curse her, to demand what she was doing, but he said nothing. He simply sat there, a statue of conflicted stillness. The wolf howled again, its cry a raw and lonely sound that mirrored the ache in her own heart. The fear and the cold and the desperate need for another human soul to hold on to in the vast, terrifying darkness overwhelmed her pride. She pressed closer to the warmth of his body. Her voice was a ragged whisper, barely audible above the crackling fire and the howling wind. "Don't stop," she breathed, the words a plea torn from the deepest part of her. "I need this." He did not answer. He did not speak again for the rest of the night. But after a long, long moment, he slowly, carefully, set the pistol down on the hearth. He shifted his weight and lay down beside her, his back to her, still not touching. Then, as another howl ripped through the night, she felt his arm move, reaching back and pulling her against him. He held her, his large, warm body, a solid shield against the cold and the fear. And in the silent, desperate darkness of the mountain cabin, he held her until the dawn. That night changed the silence between them. It was no longer a void, an awkward space to be endured, but a shared territory. When Clara awoke the next morning, she was alone in the bedroll. But the indentation of Eli's body was still beside her, and the lingering warmth was a ghost of his presence. He was already outside, the steady ring of his axe against wood a familiar, grounding sound. Nothing was said of the night before, of her fear or his comfort. No words were needed. An invisible line had been crossed, a fragile pact made in the darkness. She was no longer just a stray he had taken in. She was a part of the cabin's small, isolated world. The snow continued to fall, a soft, ceaseless curtain that entombed them on the mountain. The drifts piled higher than the window, casting the cabin in a perpetual twilight, lit only by the flickering fire and a single tallow candle. They were cut off, adrift in a sea of white. Their lives shrank to the size of the single room, their existence dictated by the fundamental rhythms of survival. They fell into a routine that was as natural and unspoken as breathing. He would chop the wood, his powerful form a dark shape against the endless snow, the axe rising and falling with a strength that seemed to defy the cold. She would haul in the buckets of snow to melt for water, her arms aching, but her spirit resolute. He would hunt and trap, returning with frozen, fur-covered offerings that she would then transform into their sustenance. She would skin the rabbits and dress the birds, her hands, once soft, becoming chapped and capable. She learned to cook over the open fire, making thick, savory stews that filled their bellies and warmed them from the inside out. They moved around each other with a quiet, practiced grace. She knew the way he took his coffee, black and scalding. He knew that she would always save a piece of hardtack to gnaw on in the late afternoon. They shared the long silences, but now they were comfortable, punctuated by the small sounds of their life together, the scrape of a spoon against a bowl, the rustle of a fur blanket, the whisper of the flames in the hearth. In this shared quiet, she began to see the man beneath the hardened exterior. She saw the gentleness in the way he handled his hunting dog, a lean hound named Blue that lived in a small lean-to outside. She saw the focus in his eyes as he mended a tear in his leather gloves, his large, scarred hands surprisingly nimble. He was a man of immense control, of deep, buried feelings that only surfaced in fleeting glances or a tightening of his jaw. One day, when the sky cleared to a brilliant, painful blue and the sun glittered on the snow, Eli announced he was going to fish. Their supply of salted meat was running low. Clara, desperate for a reprieve from the cabin's dim interior, insisted on coming with him. He resisted at first, his usual gruffness returning. "It is no place for a woman. The ice is thick, the wind is sharp." "I am stronger than I look," she countered, her chin set stubbornly. "And I will go mad if I have to stare at these four walls for another day." He relented with a sigh, a small cloud of vapor in the frigid air. He bundled her in a spare fur-lined coat that was far too large for her, its scent of pine smoke and Eli wrapping around her like an embrace. He chopped a hole in the thick ice of a frozen creek with the axe, then showed her how to bait a small, crude hook with a piece of dried meat and lower the line into the dark, churning water below. They sat on a fallen log, their lines dangling in the icy water. Not speaking, the cold was intense, seeping through their boots and coats, but the sun was bright, the air clean and sharp, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Clara felt a stirring of something other than grief or fear. After a long stretch of silence, she felt a tug on her line. With a surprised yelp, she yanked it up. A small, silver fish flopped onto the snow, glistening in the sun. A sound escaped her, one she had not made since before James's death. A laugh. It was a genuine, unrestrained peal of delight that echoed in the vast, snowy silence. She looked at Eli, her face flushed with cold and triumph. He was staring at her, and a strange, unreadable expression was on his face. And then she saw it. The corner of his mouth twitched, the barest hint of a smile, a crack in the stoic mask. It was gone as quickly as it came, but she had seen it. The sight of his fleeting smile made her laugh again, and soon she was trying to stifle giggles as she struggled to get the wriggling fish off the hook. He reached over, his large hand covering hers, and expertly freed the catch. His touch, even through their thick gloves, sent a jolt of warmth through her. "What was your life like before this?" she asked, her voice softer now, the laughter having broken the tension. "Before the mountains?" He grew still, his gaze turning distant, fixed on the far-off peaks. The ghost of a smile vanished. "I was a different man." "What happened to him?" He was silent for a long time, watching the dark water swirl in the hole he had cut. "I tried to forget him," he said finally, his voice low and rough. "Some men are not meant to be remembered." That night, huddled by the fire, the fish stewing in the pot, his words echoed in her mind. Some men are not meant to be remembered. She thought of James, of the desperate need she had to keep his memory alive, to honor the man he was. She looked at Eli, who sat staring into the flames, lost in a past he was trying to erase. His vulnerability earlier that day had opened a door, and she felt a sudden, powerful urge to walk through it, to offer him a piece of her own broken past in return. "It was not just a land dispute," she said into the quiet. He turned his head slowly, his pale eyes finding hers in the dim light. "My husband's death," she clarified, her voice barely a whisper. "James, he was a good man, a decent man. He believed in what was right." She paused, gathering her courage, the memories sharp and painful. "The land we settled, it had a good stream. Silas Croft, the big rancher, he wanted it. He tried to buy us out, but James refused. This was our dream." She stared into the fire, seeing the events play out again in the dancing flames. James found out Croft was rerouting the water from the smaller homesteads, strangling them, forcing them to sell for pennies. He was going to ride to the territorial capital, to speak to the marshal, to expose him. He told Croft as much. He thought the threat of the law would be enough. Her voice cracked, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek. The next day, Croft's men came. They said it was about the boundary line. It was an excuse. It was not a fair fight. Eli, there were 3 of them. They shot him down while he was standing in his own doorway. They murdered him. She wrapped her arms around herself, a cold dread seeping into her bones that had nothing to do with the winter outside. "The worst part," she whispered, the words tasting like ash, "is the guilt. I was inside. I heard the shots. By the time I got to him, he was gone, and all I can think is,